Good afternoon. This is a little delayed, but I'm going to do it fairly quickly. And you're going to be reading chapter 5 in our textbook, Sheltered Content Instruction. There's 2 PowerPoints, and I've also got them on as .pdf files, so you can read them. And we're going to do a little discovery here. I'll wear my Sherlock Holmes hat. Now, mind you, I'm not smoking. Anyhow, let's examine logically some very important concepts for you as an ESL teacher. And I'm going to talk about a number of things, but hopefully it won't take too long. The first thing I want to emphasize here is the importance of culture. And I mentioned on here the riddle of culture, because culture is everything. It's everything. It's everything, even the way we name our rocks, the way we name the earth, the way all the words. Language is the fundamental expression of culture. Whatever it emphasizes, whatever the expressions used, whether they're our sense of comedy, our sense of decorum, our sense of treatment of others, and things like this. Everything's reflected. You can't talk about culture and then talk about something else, because you have to use words to talk about something else. So finally, in the finality of it, culture is everything. It's the way you perceive the world from the moment you're born. It's the relationships, it's all of those things. Okay, so it's the big blah, it's everything there. So what do we do with that? As a teacher, we know some fundamental things. You'll see in that first one, what is culture, the one PowerPoint. And I've cut these down from being quite extensive or long PowerPoints that I've used before. Culture is what people believe. Culture is what people do, their activities. And 3, culture is what people make or create, whether it's an arrowhead or they write a novel. Everything behind me is a product of culture. It's a product of human activity. It was either manufactured, or it was written, or it was printed, or it was photographs were taken, or it was, whatever. So what is this? What is this important? Because you need to know, what do your students believe? You don't have to probe them about the details of their particular religion, but you need to know what they think about and what their values are. And that's the second PowerPoint. I'll talk more about that. But what do they believe about concepts like time, punctuality? We emphasize that a lot, but I know cultures that are much more punctual than American culture. What about taking time to talk to people and converse with people? That is very valuable. I know cultures where if you are always too busy to talk to people, that's very offensive to them. Okay, so we've got a number of things here that have to be taken into account. I think it's important that you think deeply about this. I mean, what is it you believe? We have this kind of consciousness going on all the time. When there's very stressful things happen, we say, well, I believe in this, or I believe in that, or something. But because I'm conscious and I want help, or I want emotional support or something. But we have ideas. What do we believe about our family and our obligations as a student, how we should treat others, moral obligations. But also, what do we believe about the environment? And what do we believe about the importance of education? And is math the most important thing, in terms of education? Or is it reading? Or do we think it's more important to be, everybody makes choices. There isn't just a universal template that says this is how it's going to be. It's very fluid. It's changing. People change their attitudes in politics over time. They change their attitudes sometimes in values over time. Sometimes upheavals, whether it's a drug addiction or a refugee situation that affects people in their own country. All of these things are very fluid. So culture is constantly shifting around on this. We like to think it's very stable and stuff, and it makes us comfortable, at least within the time we are alive. But in fact, for some people we encounter, ESL students, second language learners, they may go through all kinds of trauma. One of the more recent moves, we've had a beginning, we're working on this at UNK, is having workshops on trauma, with all kinds of personal trauma, abuse as children of alcoholics, children who are abused in one way or another, people that face, they have a car accident, or they're raising a child with disabilities of some type. And we have all kinds of challenges. And when I say trauma, I mean, that can be an outside force, it could be another person, but it could be a difficult situation that comes upon you. The power is sometimes just pure chance. Things happen to people. You're driving down the road one day, you have a car accident. You've driven it 20 years, nothing ever happened. Everything's changed. But when you deal with ESL students, they are in particular states of chaos. Often they go through, whether they crossed over a border, whether they were admitted as refugees, whether they're living in great poverty. By the way, this applies just as well to anybody else. It's just that ESL, because of the language barrier, usually if there's a language barrier, you won't know these things. They won't be very accessible, far less accessible than if they spoke English. It's bad enough all the darkness it's kept, how the difficulties of life are people keep those secrets to themselves. But you don't know when you're dealing with other cultures is what are the secrets they're keeping themselves. So there's very interesting things here to look at. So we remember, again, I'm going to repeat this: culture is what people believe, what they do, and what they make. Okay, just stick with that basic trend when you're dealing with other individuals and you're trying to get them to understand about English language learners. Always be working on helping others explore so they can find out if you're dealing with people from Southeast Asia. I think they're called the Karen, it's spelled Karen, refugee group from, I think, Myanmar, Thailand area. You won't know about their religion, and you need to find out about the religion. You may say, well, I don't know anything about Buddhism. We have a lot of students who are from a place where Buddhism's strong. Find out about Buddhism. Explore, talk to your students. Don't just go on Google and look it up, or Yahoo, and say, well, I figured that one out, because you haven't. Because everything is adjusted by the individual and the family and the culture. Culture is always mold religion. Religion's not the same just because on face of it is, whether it's Baptist or Buddhist or some other religion, Islam. The actual function of it and how it operates, all that's involved in culture. Okay, that's believing. And then what people make, what they wear, the clothing they choose. Why do they dress that way? Well, you have to find that out. So I'm giving you a real quick pitch on this, because this class is kind of a generalist overview class, but I want you to think about culture. All right, now, the other thing on the other video on the PowerPoint, and I'm kind of ignoring the chapter here because I really wanted you to look at these PowerPoints, because I'm just going to, normally I would give this in a graduate class. I go over this for a couple of weeks, but we're not in 804 multicultural education. So what do we want to talk about here? Within cultures, everybody is not the same. Remember that. That's called a stereotype. When people deal with someone from China, or they deal with someone from Russia, or someone from South Africa, or Portugal or wherever, people may, there may be an existing stereotype that's fairly familiar to people. In the old I Love Lucy shows, the first encounter most Americans had with someone that was Cuban was Ricky Ricardo, who was the Cuban band leader married to Lucille Ball. And they were actually married in real life. What does that mean? Well, it means that they did a comedy show based on their life. It was very popular. And it was the first time, really, a person who was prominently not a white American, who was a Cuban American or a Cuban, Spanish speaker, Hispanic, you might call it, was a prominent figure in the 1950s at a time when minorities weren't even on television. So people got a lot of ideas about how Cubans are from Ricky Ricardo. So they said, oh, they talk a certain way, or they're funny, or, whatever he was, that's what Cubans were. And of course, he's on a situation comedy. He wants to be funny. They want to get ratings. They want to be popular. And so the way he would talk or the way his English would come out would not be appropriate. It wouldn't be obscene, but it'd be funny because it's a mistake or something. So individuals would sometimes make incredibly stupid assumptions, and they'd come across a professor in the school and he said, oh, I saw your name was Gonzalez or Castro or whatever it was, and I just assumed you taught Spanish and that you were like Ricky Ricardo. Really dumb things. But the way humans operate, they operate in generalizations, and what you want to do is to explore that individual as much as you're able to, respectfully, and find out about their culture and find out about their family. So that's the fundamental thing you have to do. How do you find out about them? Well, I've done the culture map with you. I think some of you, I have you draw your hometown or something, and then you draw what's important to you, and then you talk about it and stuff. It's good ESL practice, academically. Kids talk, and if they can write about it if they want. And drawing is a very natural thing. Most people can draw no matter what language they speak. Okay. Now the values, and that's what I'm getting into when I talk about going into the details. What are the values? The values are as many facets of human life and culture and living. Values, we often hear people talk about family values. What's your idea about the family? Is it the nuclear family? Do they go to church every Sunday? My Three Stooges, I have to wait for this. I always take the Pledge of the Stooges. Dun, dun, dun. Thank you, Mo. Rest in peace. Okay, now, gosh, I forget myself. The values within each culture are different. There's a range. Give an example. Let's say you're in a culture that emphasizes the individual at all costs. The individual is the most important thing. An example, in our historical myths or beliefs about the Old West, we always emphasize the individual cowboy, the individual gunslinger, or the man that's he's the wagon train leader, and he's taking people west in wagon trains, and he's facing off against a hostile environment and everything you could imagine along the way, running out of water, getting stuck, hit by tornadoes, attacks from people rightfully protecting their land. Think about that one. And so the individual, and you see that in Western movies, and that's such a genre, so powerful. John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, it's me, and I'm here, and I'm up against everything else. Whether you watch the old movie High Noon, where the sheriff, Gary Cooper, has to stand up against 4 men coming back to town to raise hell, and he's trying to get people to be his deputies, and nobody will help him. Everybody's abandoned him. because they don't want any trouble. And you've seen that around where everybody says, look, hey, you're into trouble with that guy. He's dangerous. I don't have anything to do with it. That's up to you. You got to handle it yourself. That individualism, you could say it's pretty strong, certainly in the American mindset. We don't wait and get everybody to agree with us before we make a move, at least in some respects. In other respects, we're big cowards like everybody else. But in many cultures, individualism is a terrible thing. In certain Asian cultures, and I'm not picking one, I could say Japan, because they do emphasize a lot that the group and the values of the group are absolutely critical. Anyone who tries to be different is criticized. So if you're a little kid and you decide that you're going to do something that's different from the group, you're going to be criticized. And that criticism and shunning or whatever it is forces you back into the group. So they call that the individual versus the collective. Sounds like the Borg. But the collective is the group thinks for everybody else. Certainly that's true if you're on a football team. If you're on a football team and you decide you're going to do something different, that doesn't cut it. It's not allowed. But there are situations, in the Army's an example where you worship individual courage, but they emphasize the team. Sometimes you do what you have to do to help everyone else. You're not allowed to be different because being different endangers the group. So that's a very strong pull. In America, we tend to think we're individuals, but there are other cultures where individuals are even more individual than we are. Even the way I'm talking about this right now and with these PowerPoints is all kind of based on an American viewpoint. Now that'll blow your mind. It's like saying, you don't have the be all end all ultimate measuring stick for all these values, because you're taking American values and you're putting them on a scale and then you're sticking them in Afghanistan or Uganda or someplace, and then you're saying, wow, this doesn't seem to work quite the right way. So you have to really loosen it back up to get some perspective. Okay, what are values? I mentioned one about the individual and the group. What are other values? Values about wealth. Here's an interesting thing. I believe it's in Sweden that there are very rich people and very just people of average means. In Sweden, it's considered absolutely wrong to show off your wealth or to talk about how much money you have. That is completely uncouth. It's unacceptable. Now, in Hollywood, and on American television with all the characters bragging about saying, oh, look at my ring, look what I got, look at my phone. And I'm showing it because I've got it out here. Look at my clothes and the way I'm dressed. There are cultures in Scandinavian cultures that being an individual bragging about money and your personal accomplishments is completely unacceptable. People will treat you like, you're a snake or something. What is wrong with you? You don't brag about it. Bragging is just horrible. There are other cultures where bragging is very, I imagine if we talk about Australians, I would guess. We always emphasize the shrimp on the Barbie, and we got all these stereotypes about Australians. But if you go to Australia, you don't know how. You have to interact with people individually to find out what their values are. The worst thing you can do is sit there, and even things I've said here, is sit there and try to make some generalization about another culture. It usually offends them. And so mostly observation and neutral questions are really good. So if you're dealing with kids from another culture, they may be from El Salvador, Guatemala in your schools, or from Southeast Asia, the best way is observation and very kind of don't assume anything don't talk about, like, say, how much money does your father make and things like that. Questions like that can be very offensive. So you probe very indifferently. Think about American culture. Think about Nebraska culture. I've observed Nebraska culture for 22 years since I've been up here, 23 years almost now. And I've developed generalizations about Nebraskans, but not necessarily stereotypes. I have to be careful because I can't assume if you're in this class and you're from Nebraska that, oh, you are a certain way here or there. There is such a thing, I think, as Nebraska nice. Why do I mention this and not avoid mentioning this? Because being called nice is not generally offensive. If I were to say a certain group that they are not particularly educationally committed or not very smart or something, made some derogatory statement like that about somebody, that would be very offensive. I'd get in a lot of trouble saying that on a video or saying that to anyone. So when you talk about dealing with another culture, you always look for the best in that culture or what you think are the best, and you emphasize that, okay? And you observe other things along the way. What you have to realize that you can't say I've observed 3 people on living in Southeast Kansas, and I'll tell you all about the people in Southeast Kansas. So it takes time to know that. A really good way to tell things is when people marry into other families and you have relatives or in-laws in other parts of the country. And I talk to people all the time. They got relatives that live up in Connecticut or they live in Florida or Appalachia, wherever. And sometimes, with in-laws or other members of their family even, they get really critical and they say some pretty bad things about them. And I can see why they're upset with them and they don't particularly like them. But I don't lump it over and say, well, that's the way they behave in Rhode Island or Massachusetts. I try to keep it on a individual basis or a small group basis. I don't expand the old category to take in other people. If I run into somebody that's very irritating and dishonest and it's kind of like a person you want to avoid, maybe a criminal or something, I don't say, yeah, that's typical of that state. I may in my mind think a lot of things, but I don't say them because what you say, you have to hold up to, you own up to. Okay. Now, I talk about other values. That the value spectrums in that second PowerPoint or document. Attitudes, I said individual, collective. Attitudes about the environment. Attitudes about the weather in the environment. People talk about the weather and that's a big topic in Nebraska or in a lot of parts of middle United States. People talk about the weather. It's kind of an American thing. They may talk about the weather in England to some extent. It's usually seen as a safe topic because most people, when they have communication with others, you don't want to start out saying that so-and-so running for office is a lying so-and-so, because somebody's going to contradict you or you're going to get in an argument. So a lot of people don't even talk about politics nowadays and I don't on here very much because I know, I could assume certain things, but I'd make a fool of myself because there are bound to be people who have very radically different attitudes. I teach a multicultural class. And I have people that have expressed attitudes that are pretty narrow. I'll just say that, very narrow. They'll say, I'll mention a certain group and they'll say, yeah, but they should have done this and here's what's wrong with that group. And I kind of let them just go on. If somebody else in the class wants to cut them down. And if I have anything to say to them, I never say it in front of others or on the discussion page. I will email them directly or if necessary, call them. Because I like to explore, even when I run into stuff that's negative, I want to find out what's the story behind this. Is this person really that negative and anti a certain group? And I want to know what caused that if I can find out. I promise not to make this too long. So I'm not going to do massive amounts about this cultural thing, but I want you to at least look at the PowerPoints, think about them. Attitudes, I mentioned the environment. Attitudes about time is huge. Some people measure other cultures and they say, oh, they're late all the time. Or they're going to start their quinceanera, or they're going to start I remember a powwow once, Native American, and I had the false impression, even though it said on the poster starting at 4 o'clock and they had a question mark. And I realized when I went to it, I got fried bread and I really enjoyed it. But I was an observer, this was in Oklahoma. And I realized at some point, I said, the meeting may not start for 3 hours after you get there, thinking, it's going to start at 4. No, it'll start when it's ready to start. It might take 3 hours to start. At some point, someone will, as my dad would say, take a notion and start the meeting. Okay. Now, we wouldn't operate that way. I wouldn't have a faculty meeting and say, we're going to meet at 4. Oh, by the way, we're just going to sit around until I feel like we're ready to meet. Maybe we'll wait till 6. That wouldn't even be a fair equivalent, because you have to understand the culture. I know country people very well. I think I know country people, farmers, at least in Missouri and places like that. And I know individuals like my sister-in-law that she will go to get something and she'll be right back, and she won't be back for 2 hours. Now you might say, why is Linda doing that? And say, it's because she's met people along the way and she talks to them because she likes to talk, and she talks. I do the same thing. You can tell on here I talk too much. But she talks to people and she may not get back with cold drinks for like an hour. And so they're not quite as cold. But the fact is that that's a part of her personality. It's also a way a lot of people communicate. If you don't stop and talk to people, you don't know anything. She's not an internet person. Just racing from one place to the next and not talking is not part of their culture. But if you go to New York City or you go to large cities or something, you don't spend your time looking at other people and starting up random conversations. That's just not done. Okay? That's in fact considered odd, and you're going to get in trouble because you don't know who's out there. So there's a kind of a general attitude of stay closed in public and just move, stay anonymous. And that's not true in country. In fact, if you're out if you're a farmer or you have some new people move in and no one ever sees them and they don't talk to anybody, everyone gets suspicious. Why are they staying in like that? Well, they're not very friendly, are they? You take the measure of each little environment you're in, you try to figure it out. Now it gets much more complicated when you introduce cultures that have all kinds of rules about men and women can't shake hands, eye contact rules, which often are not mentioned but are big deals. Because if you stare at people, it's considered weird. And it's even in our environment. If I were to go in class and I would just stare at a student, or a student stared at another student, you'd think, what are they doing? Why are they looking at me? And so it makes, we have all kinds of, what they call it, personal distance. The word will come to me. But it's rules about personal space, okay? And there's actually a science. Science, they study that, just like you would study if you were studying a group of birds flying in formation, how close they get and how they move off. People do that too. Other things I like to mention in that video, and other things you talk about power distances. Like if you're the principal of the school and I'm a parent or a child in the school, do I just go up and talk to you casually, or do I stay away from you? In many cultures, the officials are not to be trifled with. You stay away from them. You don't go up and just willingly engage the police and chat, or you don't even call the police, because in some cultures, the police themselves are dishonest and corrupt. So reporting a crime is just going to get you involved with a second crime, because you may get arrested instead of the person that you're trying to, the concept of justice may not operate. The concept of law and order may not be the same. That's why people don't report crimes sometimes in their neighborhood. They don't want to bring in outsiders. If I'm afraid of immigration and I think the police are going to help the Immigration or Border Patrol, even if nobody's done anything wrong or broken any rules, we don't want them over there because we don't know what's going to happen. Okay? You see that in African-American police conflicts in the United States and other groups. That's very controversial. I mean, that's electric. If I make a statement one way or the other, somebody will get upset and say, Dr. Tracy's not helping the police, or Dr. Tracy's supporting racists, or Dr. Tracy, you know, so you observe these things, you know, and then that's why we get to watch it on YouTube. And now with the internet and with Facebook and with the YouTube and with instant viral videos, and people now actually show things in real time that they happened, and they can get that information back. So you see people doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and then trying to justify it later, saying what you're seeing is not what you think you're seeing. So anyhow, culture is a matter of observation. It's a matter of thinking about how you choose to react or interact with groups. You as a teacher, and I'm going to have to end this because I don't want to go any longer, but the main thing here is that it's a real riddle, and people will assume things, and they may react to another culture in a way that makes a bigger conflict. Or they insult them, and then the other culture reacts, and then you get an even bigger conflict. So these are all things that are very, very important. And I could talk for an hour. I don't think you want to listen to another hour, but look at my PowerPoints and be aware of this. In other classes, I'll talk about culture more. So look at the chapters. Chapter 5, we're skipping around because this a little bit about PSYOP, and I've got another course on PSYOP I'm teaching, 328. So have a good night. I'm going to go get some more coffee, and I'm going to come back and do my next class. So thank you.